Hi everyone, welcome to the September 5th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski, and we're right on the heels of Labor Day weekend as we're recording this on Tuesday morning. Just finished up the Saratoga meet yesterday as they had their closing Monday card completed with the hopeful being run. We're going to talk about all of the stakes action from this past week at Saratoga. Saturday was the Grade 1 Jockey Club Gold Cup, including other stakes on that undercard. The Spinaway was Sunday, the hopeful, the traditional day, closing day feature at Saratoga. So we'll wrap up that Saratoga meet by discussing that final week of action, including plenty of impressive two-year-old performances, though maybe not necessarily all in the stakes races, more so in maiden events, but we'll talk about that as we go through. Then we'll move on to Del Mar, where their feature race on Saturday was the Pacific Classic. We'll talk about the undercard stakes that also took place, some on the turf, some on the main track, the Del Mar Derby on Sunday as we wrap up that Del Mar action. I think they have one more week left in their meet as they'll conclude with some of those two-year-old grade ones next week. But we'll look back on that Pacific Classic Saturday, and then we'll move on to Kentucky Downs. They obviously got their brief meet rolling. We'll discuss the Mint Millions, the Dueling Grounds Derby and Oaks, and some others from Kentucky Downs. Then we'll finish things up by talking about a maiden race that earned a nice speed figure at Ellis Park all the way back at the beginning of last week. But Craig, a lot of stakes action, as is always the case, closing weekend at Saratoga. We don't have to rehash it all. It was certainly a trying Saratoga meet for a lot of reasons, but the closing week went pretty smoothly, and we saw some nice performances.
We did. We saw some good speed figures. As you mentioned, a lot of maidens we're going to talk about. Seems like some waited longer to be unveiled in the meet, and, that's fine. 2-year-olds maybe getting a little later start isn't always a bad thing, and just lots of big racing. I may be a little groggy today because I stayed up wanting to get those figures from Monday done that we're going to talk about today. Just a couple from Saratoga, but just overall a really, really nice week of racing, and for once, pretty uneventful.
Yeah, I saw your rundown email to me came in very late in my inbox. So I think I have a clue about how late you stayed up trying to get those figs done, but I understand and we appreciate it as we are recording this podcast at our usual time, even after the holiday weekend. Well, let's look back at, the feature race from last week at Saratoga to start things off, the Grade 1 Jockey Club Gold Cup on Saturday. And, Craig, we kind of knew going in it was not a vintage edition of the Jockey Club Gold Cup, lacking some of the star power that we've seen in a few of the other grade ones at this meet. Some races that did have small fields, but nevertheless drew really talented horses. Maybe not so much the case in this Jockey Club Gold Cup. We kind of got some of the B-level players in this handicap division. And the winner of the race, Bright Future, aptly named, definitely a horse that's on the upswing. He's a progressive sort, has really come to hand this season, but it's just not a race that is going to get anybody too excited about these horses' prospects for the Breeders' Cup Classic.
No, sometimes I'm a little happy to do some hyperbole, and the one thing I said was if any of these horses show up for the Breeders' Cup, just put a big red X through them, because the figure was a 118 for me. Downgraded a tiny bit from a 120 final time figure. Maybe that 120 is a little more representative of what we saw from Bright Future, but this just was not a grade 1 race. It didn't look like one coming in. Bright Future did run a career best, but I'm not sure how much more improvement I saw in him the way he was finishing off the race when he was almost run down by Proxy. So not a lot to get excited about for me. Before we get too deep in this card, I did want to ask you, I noticed that it's coated in the bright red. Did you think it was a speed favoring track?
I couldn't necessarily say that about the Saturday card in isolation. We did see a few gate-to-wire winners, including a really impressive one that we're going to talk about in just a little bit. Speed was definitely pretty good the final weekend at Saratoga, but I wouldn't term it as a bias. We definitely saw some races fall apart, especially when the paces got really hot. So, it always helps to have speed on the dirt. As far as this Jockey Club Gold Cup goes, though, I feel like the moderate pace of this race just really played to the strengths of the horses that were forward, and Bright Future was just always in the right position, stalking outside under Javier Castellano, who we should mention, while he maybe didn't have a Saratoga meet that was full of victories at every level, he was certainly never in the conversation for being one of the meet leaders, but winning the Travers and the Jockey Club Gold Cup, it's not too bad, and it was certainly capping off what's been a great spring to summer season for Javier Castellano to get this victory with this horse who just barely held off Proxy. And Proxy, credit to Joel Rosario for keeping this horse a little bit more in the game early. He was relatively close to the pace and I think got a good trip, but Proxy is just a frustrating horse, Craig. I mean, he gets there and just seems to fall short a little too often for his connections liking or his backers liking, just falling short by a nose here. He's got talent, but I don't think anybody's going to mistake Proxy as being one of the best horses in this division.
Oh, and you say he's a frustrating horse. I love Proxy because he is a great baseline for making speed figures. He basically shows up, runs the same exact speed figure almost every single time out. At least the last 7 or 8 times, he's always right hovering around that 120 mark. So, as a speed figure guy, we do kind of like these horses. Not a whole lot to add about the others. I was a little intrigued by Tyson showing up from Canada, a horse we talked about. From his wins there. He ran fine, but he showed he's probably a little bit better on synthetic, and nobody else really ran much. Rattle and Roll, I think, went off the favorite. He just did no running whatsoever. So, again, not the strongest addition, and I'm not too high on these horses going forward.
Yeah, Rattle and Roll was definitely the most noteworthy no-show in this race. Probably a little farther back than maybe you wanted to be in this race, but that's just his running style, and he just could never get involved, especially given how quickly they came home in this race. Let's move on to some of the other Grade 1 action that took place in the latter portion of this weekend. Sunday's feature, the Grade 1 Spinaway, and a couple of nice 2-year-old fillies putting on a show here with Bright Work just barely holding off Ways and Means at the end to win this race by half a length and to basically solidify her status as the leading 2-year-old filly right now. She's got these 2 graded stakes wins in Saratoga and has looked good winning both of them. Ways and Means, you could argue, maybe the horse you want a little more moving forward because she definitely had some trouble of her own doing, but I mean, just the second start of her career, perhaps you can give her an excuse for that. And I mean, she actually ran really well to get as close to Brightwork as she did at the end, but Brightwork's experience fighting for victories in the past really came through here.
Yeah, I don't want to take too much away from Bright Work. Like you said, Ways and Means had a little trouble, also had a bit of a wider trip, though it's not like Bright Work was on the rail or anything, just Ways and Means was a little further outside. And Bright Work was game all the way to the wire. Looked like Ways and Means might go by it once you got to about the furlong pole, and Bright Work just dug in, ran a 104 speed figure, same thing she had run last time out in her win, and Ways and Means showed a little improvement speed figure wise. So I think it was a good, strong race, and I expect these to be good fillies going forward.
Yeah, obviously there were a lot of expectations around Ways and Means coming off her visually impressive debut score earlier in the meet at Saratoga, actually on the same day that Brightwork won that Adirondack. She ran really well here. I'm not going to take anything away from either of these horses. Brightwork obviously dug in to get that victory, but Ways and Means, I don't know if she actually clipped heels on the backstretch, but it was just a really awkward move when she was trying to extricate herself from traffic, or Flavian Pratt was trying to extricate her from some traffic after she did break a half step slowly. And like you said, just wider around the far turn. And there was a moment in an upper stretch where it looked like Brightwork might pull away from her, but Ways and Means dug in and never stopped trying to the finish line. So good fight from her as well. We'll see how far both of these fillies ultimately want to go. I wouldn't say either one of them has pedigrees that say that they're going to be getting so much better with added ground, but the way that they ran here and fought on through the 7 furlongs, a mile might be in their wheelhouse, so we'll see where they meet again in the future. I would imagine Ways and Means is going to go on to the Frisette. We'll see where John Ortiz decides to run Brightwork next time out, but definitely seems like 2 of the top 2-year-old fillies that we've seen so far this season. Moving on to Monday's closing day feature, the Grade 1 Hopeful. A lot of expectations heaped on this race, just given the way the field came up. Obviously, things got a little bit softer once Muth was scratched on the morning of the race. I know people were interested to see how some of that California form would stack up against the best on the East Coast, but I don't know what happened, Craig. I mean, obviously the pace had a lot to do with the result of this race, but so many of these horses had run impressive speed figures coming in here, looked like sorts that would continue improving, and it just didn't happen. Almost everybody took a step backwards, except for the winner, Nutella Fella.
Yeah, I mean, a few horses ran okay. Nutella Fella wound up with what I would term a very disappointing 96 time form US speed figure for a race that came in with such high expectations. And I think it was almost all due to the pace. And it's one of those where I'm not sure the algorithm we use is actually perfect for 2-year-olds when they go this fast. Maybe it just is a little too much when they're this young and not quite as developed as older horses because make no mistake, they were absolutely flying. The opening quarter pace figure was a 140, and I think it was just way too much for some of these horses. I mean, we see in older horses when they go this distance, if you run a 140, they're going to get tired, but my supposition is just that it's way too much this early in their careers, and it showed in the way a lot of these horses were finishing.
Yeah, there was a lot of staggering going on in the final eighth of a mile of this race, and credit to Junior Alvarado, who gave Nutella Fella a perfect trip, did not panic after this horse broke slowly behind the field, just let him settle, and it all worked out. He saved the ground, was able to find some room switching to the outside in the middle of the stretch, and he ran this field down, and Gary Contessa, who had retired from training for a few years, just kind of was off the scene for a little while. He's come back in a big way, now collecting his second graded stakes victory of the season with a 2-year-old after he won that feature opening weekend, the Schuylerville, with his horse Becky's Joker, and now Nutella Fella bookending the meet with these graded stakes victories. That's a pretty big deal for Gary Contessa, who definitely was not regularly winning races like this, going all the way back to what he was trading with a much larger stable. I think he did win the Spinaway with a horse Sippacan Harbor a number of years ago at a big price. But Nutella Fella, similar kind of thing. Just maybe not the best of this division so far, but taking advantage of the situation when it presented itself. Timberlake, who ran second here, I think you could make a strong argument that he ran the best race of anybody because he was right up in there, contesting that early pace and was actually behind horses, taking some kickback, getting a little bit rank with the blinkers, just wanting to do more in the early stages than he was even being allowed to do by Florent Giroux, and found a seam in the stretch and made a nice run through. Just couldn't hold off that deep closing winner, but I thought Timberlake fought on pretty well and is one that you can have some confidence just based on the stamina he showed here, potentially going a little longer in the future.
Yeah, and he got the best time form US speed figure by a pretty big margin at a 103. Over the winner, at least. There was another horse, Mission Beach, who was contesting that piece early, who got a 101, finished back in fifth, so just a couple points behind. But I also think Timberlake had some trouble as you were talking to it. It looked like he wanted to go, and maybe not being able to go actually helped him because we see what happened to all the horses up on the pace. But just a race that fell apart. Kind of at least to my eyes, a little funny thing. The most predictable thing ever was that Valentine Candy would basically run a figure that matched what we originally had. And I'm not saying I know I changed the speed figure, the buyer team changed their speed figure, and I'm fine with it. It's probably still the right call, but it's just the way these things seem to work out in the horse racing, where when you think you're fixing something, the horse doesn't live up to it. But that horse just didn't show up on this day.
No, and I don't think that means anything towards the speed figure being should being lower. I mean, I think you made the right move upgrading that speed figure. There is so much evidence, and we'll talk about some of it later in this podcast, of horses coming out of that race to do well. Once Valentine Candy didn't get within a length of the early lead in the early stages, he broke a little bit flat-footed. I mean, that basically sealed the deal for him. He was a horse that needed to be in front to have his best chance. So he definitely had an excuse. And it's not like Valentine Candy was the only horse that didn't run back to his maiden speed figure in this race. There were a lot of horses that had shown speed in their maiden victories that regressed in this spot. It was just the way that the race flowed. I think this is a race that a lot of people are going to be disappointed in. I would anticipate we're going to see some horses coming out of this race that do a lot better in their subsequent starts when they're able to make better use of their early speed or tactical speed, and some potentially going longer distances. I'm not going to write off all these horses just because they ran in a slow edition of the hopeful. I think there's still some talent in this field.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to what I said earlier. If older horses ran a 140 pace figure, going 7 furlongs, you would expect them to get tired. I just think it was way too much to ask of these horses so early in their careers, and it showed in the results. Now, they may need a little time to recover from that because it was probably a pretty strenuous race, but I would expect a lot of horses to bounce back, and it's one other than like the winner and horses who were off the pace where I'll trust the speed figure, which was three of the top four. The ones who were contesting the pace, I'm not going to put any stock in it and just kind of base them off of previous races.
Let's go back to Saturday and discuss some of the undercard stakes that were run before that Jockey Club Gold Cup. Arguably the most impressive stakes victory that we saw on Saturday was turned in by the winner of the Grade 2 Prioress, Alva Star, who is a filly that just hasn't run a bad race yet in 5 career starts, and she's now won these last 2 in a row in very impressive fashion, drawing off to these decisive victories. First at Delaware against older horses in her prior race, and now she took that form here to beat a couple of good fillies. And just, I mean, the horse who was second in this race, I mean, had form that was competitive with Alva Star going back just a couple of months, but clearly this filly has taken a big step forward over the summer.
Yeah, I remember we previewed this race for Saturday, and I think my top selection had been Dazzling Blue, but I mentioned that I didn't have the morning line at the time, and that Alva Star was a horse who I thought had every right to win this race, but I certainly wasn't expecting what we saw on Saturday. She just absolutely crushed this field, and she did it setting a solid pace, was contested early by Jersey Pearl, and just put that one away and kept going all the way to a 121 TimeformUS speed figure. So huge effort from her, and makes you wonder, what's in her future, because that kind of figure is one that would be competitive in a race like the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Sprint. I mean, she would obviously run into some very good older fillies that we've seen this year, including Echo Zulu and even Goodnight Olive. But she's improving, and she's really good.
Yeah, probably not the best year for a 3-year-old filly to take a shot at that Breeders' Cup Filly and Bear Sprint, just given the strength that we saw in the Ballerina a couple of weeks ago. But obviously, this is a really nice horse. I wonder if they'll go to a race like the Raven Run at Keeneland, and then maybe they'll see about the Breeders' Cup. But she's really good. Dazzling Blue was just a crazy price in this race to be as low as she was, odds on. I mean, she didn't even have the fastest speed figure coming in. That was the winner, Alva Star, who had run so fast in her prior race at Delaware, and Dazzling Blue was just coming off a perfect trip. I mean, it was just connections that she got bet so heavily. Alva Star, obviously going out for a trainer that's an unfamiliar name to a lot of people, but we've seen him have a good horse in the past, and obviously it was able to handle this one well as she put in her career best effort here, so definitely intrigued to see what we get from Alva Star down the line. And a little bit earlier in the day on Saturday at Saratoga, we saw pretty uninspiring edition of the Flower Bowl, I guess is the way I'll put it. Just 4 horses signed on to contest this race, which is disappointing in and of itself, given the former stature of a race like the Flower Bowl, which used to be a Grade 1 and one of the championship races in the entire division for fillies and mares. That's no longer the case. But as far as the way this race played out on the track, Craig, the pace obviously had a huge impact on the outcome, as they just didn't afford any respect to Parnack, let her sneak away on the front end, setting her own pace, and when it came time to sprint for home, she just had way too much left in the tank for them to catch her.
I guess I get it because I didn't afford any respect to Parnack when we did our preview of this race coming out of that Dick Memorial. But she was the horse who looked like she'd be in front. We did talk about that on the pace projector. And at this point, you really can't be surprised when this happens on the NYRA circuit. I mean, there's just a lot of times these horses are ignored, and it's one thing for her to be in the lead, but to be clear and then actually opening up on the field at a point where you wonder what the other riders were thinking as she's just getting away from them a little bit. And it was just too much to do as she flew home. This was a race is getting a big pace upgrade from us. The final time was only 108, obviously, because of that pace, upgraded to where the winner got a 121. I don't know how much these figures will have much relevance going forward. Another race where I'd be leaning on other races rather than this one, but just a good lesson that speed is always dangerous. And it's not like Parnak came in looking like a complete long shot in here. I mean, she had some decent races on her resume. So just not sure sometimes what some of the riders are thinking. And I mean, Irad Ortiz, he's a great rider, obviously. Arguably the best rider in the country, but he's just not going to go up and challenge. Joel Rosario is not going to go challenge when he's on a horse without speed. And these are the kind of things that can happen.
Yeah, this is a race that is not getting the P notation in Timeform US because it's not some sort of artificial pace upgrade. It's just the algorithm that is adjusting for how fast these horses come home on the turf that's upgrading the fig so much from the final time for Parnak to get a 121 winning this race. But like you said, probably not a situation you want to put too much stock in when the whole field gets this gigantic upgrade just because they went so slowly early and everybody has to come home fast. We've got 3 horses in this race that got 120 time plus Timeform US speed figures. I'm probably taking those all with a grain of salt because I guess McCulloch maybe deserves to get the best speed figure of the crew, although Amazing Grace was actually gaining ground on her at the end. She was coming home even faster at the end of this race, but I don't really know what to make of all that. Frankly, I thought both of those 2 closers were a little bit disappointing. It's not like they were, it's not like they got within a head of Parnak at the end. I mean, she was a clear winner of this race, as they all kind of just came home at the same pace. So it's one of those where I take issue with the fig a little bit, but I get why the algorithm is spitting out the number that it does. Let's move on to the final stakes that we'll discuss from that Saturday card, the only non-graded stakes they ran, the Harvey Pack. And, Craig, don't want to spend too much time on the winning performance because I don't think anyone's going to mistake Thin White Duke for being a player in the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint or anything like that. He's just not among the most talented turf sprinters out there in the country, but it's a cool story that Thin White Duke wins this race for the 2nd year in a row, and it used to be called the Lucky Coin. They changed the name to the Harvey Pack this year, which appropriately honors just a stalwart of New York racing television for many years and decades, Harvey Pack, who a lot of people grew up watching in this sport, and really cool that the owner of the first edition of the Harvey Pack, the winner of the race, is Steve Christ, who obviously had a relationship with Harvey Pack going back a number of years, and it's just a really neat story that, it's funny how these things happen sometimes. People talk about the racing gods and these storybook endings, and we definitely got one of those in this race.
Yeah, and nice call by you as well. This horse ran a nice race, got a 118 Timeform US speed figure. I agree, probably not a Breeders' Cup horse, but definitely a nostalgic race for someone like me who, when I used to go to Saratoga in my younger years, I mean, going to Ciro's and seeing Harvey Pack. And Steve Chris was on that show at times. It was always just a blast. It was just something you would get out of bed for and get up and go do. It was like it was a must thing. It was just part of your day at Saratoga to go see Harvey Pack do the show. So really cool story. Nice to see. And pretty solid race too. Big Invasion was a little bit of a disappointment, but he just seems like a horse who hasn't really progressed as much as a 4-year-old as you would have liked. He's still pretty good, but he's just not taking that step forward you would have liked to see based on how easily he was winning some races as a 3-year-old.
Yeah, Harvey Pack, who I never met personally, but I mean, he was a huge part of fostering my passion in horse racing. I used to go to those seminars at Ciro's when I was 9, 10, 11 years old with my dad and my uncle. When I first started coming up to Saratoga, I would just sit there in the front row with my Saratoga water and take notes on what he and all the DRF guests or Andy Serling, who he would have on quite a bit, would say. And then I'd go to the track afterwards and watch the replays that they talked about in the replay center, because that's really the only access I had to replays at that point in time. And I mean, just kind of learning about the game from those experienced horse players and being presented it in that light. It was just a big part of my education in the game. So it was cool to see that, and brings back a lot of memories. Let's move on to the Grade 3 Saranac, which was on a little bit earlier in the week at Saratoga. That was the Friday future race, run early in the day. And this one, not the most interesting wagering affair. Carl Spackler looked really tough to beat on paper, and he was just better than the competition here. Chad Brown kind of saying this race, just using it as a stepping stone. He's probably going to try older horses at Keeneland, maybe in the Grade 1 turf mile. And he just asserted his dominance over a field that he was supposed to beat.
Yeah, he's a good horse, no doubt about it. He improved his speed figure once again up to a 118. Something he's taken small steps forward in every single start, speed figure wise. Even the time he ran eighth in what was considered its disappointing effort. So he's one with talent. It's always tough on turf for 3-year-olds to beat older horses. So it'll be interesting to see if he does show up at Keeneland. He would obviously need to take another step forward. But there are still, especially on turf, there are races left for 3-year-olds as well. So we'll see where he shows up. But I imagine Carl Spackler is a name we're going to be hearing for a while in graded stakes races.
Well, now let's discuss some of those maiden performances by the 2-year-olds that took place this past week at Saratoga, and there are several of them that earned some nice speed figures. Let's begin with Wednesday maiden special weight event won by the 2-year-old filly Emery for Brad Cox. This one was part of a Stone Street entry with a Todd Pletcher runner who didn't perform that well, but Emery just much the best on this occasion. This was a race that was weakened by scratches a little bit, but the second and third place finishers both had decent prior form, and Emery was simply better than them.
Yeah, this was the opener on the day after the steeplechase was canceled because of the weather. And yeah, Emery was really good. As you say, it wasn't like it was a race. There were a lot of horses who had run. They had run decent speed figures, and she made quick work of them. And I'm always a little bit more impressed when a horse is able to come from a little bit behind in their debut. Not like she was way back in the pack, but she was able to sit in third, sit off the rail a bit, and just really powered home. It seemed like Tyler Gaffleone knew what was underneath of him the entire time. Wasn't taking any chances and just absolutely cruised home. Got a 103 TimeformUS speed figure, so one to watch.
Then on Thursday, we saw another 2-year-old filly performance by Life Talk. This one going a mile in a maiden special weight event, a mile out of that Wilson Chute, which they've run a couple of those scheduled for the mile distance at this meet. Most of the mile races that we've seen have been off the turf races and horses that didn't really want to be on the dirt. But Life Talk obviously was intended to go longer here after closing well to be second in her sprint debut for Todd Pletcher. And this field, I think I can say with some confidence, wasn't very good. There wasn't too much behind her in this race, but Life Talk was a decisive winner, and the way she opened up with the quarter pole, showing that turn of foot to spur away from this field, I think is indicative of her quality.
Yeah, this was one I was a little, do I put it on, do I not? But she won so easily. She got a triple digit speed figure at a 101. And she also was able to do it by coming from off the pace, something you don't often see in these 2-year-old maiden races. So good, strong effort by her. And it would seem like the intent with her going a mile, she's going to like going longer based on how she ran in this race.
Yeah, she's a daughter of gun runner, definitely had no trouble handling the stretch out and distance. She's still pretty green. She lugged in somewhat concerningly at the top of the stretch, and luckily she was moving so fast, she was clear of the horse that she otherwise would have cut off. I mean, the way that she was finishing this race, I think, says that a little bit, even more distance is not going to be a problem for her. We'll just see how good she turns out to be, because like I said, she wasn't beating much in the way of competition on Thursday of last week. We did see a horse beat some nice ones, or at least run so well that it didn't matter who was behind him on Friday, and going the same mile distance out of the Wilson Chute was the 2-year-old colt Locked, who is a stablemate of Life Talk, also going out for the Todd Pletcher barn. And this is a horse that I think we can rightly get pretty excited about, Craig, because he had obviously run well on debut. That's a race that was much talked about at the time because he blew the start, made this big sustained run through the final half mile of the race to go from last all the way up to third behind a couple of horses who came back to disappoint in the hopeful, but still seemed like a couple of talented 2-year-olds in that Lucas horse Just Steel as well as BU. And Locked was getting to them at the end, galloped out past the field, so definitely had a right to appreciate the added ground on Friday, and he certainly did. And what was most encouraging to me, Craig, is this horse quickly got over his gait issues, just went right to get into a forward position, showed better tactical speed, and when they asked him to go about the half-mile pole, he again put in that half-mile run to finish, but did so just drawing off from the field.
Yeah, this was impressive visually and numerically. I mean, he's getting a 110 time form US speed figure. There were other Wilson shoot races on the card, so it wasn't like it was an overly tough speed figure to make. Similar to the other race, I'm not sure what was in behind him. I mean, the runner up, drum roll please, seemed to run a good race for Brad Cox. There wasn't a whole lot to go on coming in based on the debuts of the ones who had ran, but irregardless, I think Locked is a really good one who just powered his way home. The final time figure was actually a 114. It got knocked down a little bit because the pace was slow early, but I say slow only because of how fast he finished.
Yeah, I mean, I say it doesn't matter who was behind him because, I mean, drum roll, please, ran well. Drum roll, please, is a horse we'd probably be talking quite a bit about if Locked weren't in the race, but Locked beat him by 7 lengths. And drumroll please was 13 lengths ahead of the rest of the field. So yeah, I mean there might have been some lackluster horses in behind those two, but does it really matter when they're beaten that far? These two are really good. Locked obviously going to go on to stakes in his next start almost certainly. Probably a race like the Breeders' Futurity might be on his calendar. I haven't seen any reporting on that, but you'd imagine he's the type that'd be looking to get out around 2 turns as soon as possible, just given the way he's finishing off these races. Because even though he made that quick rush to the lead at the half mile pole, he still seemed like he had a ton of energy coming to the finish of this race and was tough to pull up. So, I mean, this is a good horse. Another one by Gun Runner who's having no trouble stretching out in distance. Drumroll please, probably going to break his maiden pretty soon. He had run well on debut, and even better here, he was actually one of two Brad Cox runners that really improved and unfortunately had to settle for second behind a pair of impressive performances this past weekend. Both he and his workmate Dive Bomber, who we'll talk about in just a little bit, finished second to some good maiden breakers. But I think we saw some real talent among these maiden races on closing weekend. And then we'll move on to the Saturday maiden special weight race that I was just referring to. General Partner, another horse coming out of that Valentine Candy maiden race who took a huge step forward from a speed figure standpoint in his second start, was able to get the victory here, just rocketed off to the front end and just never looked back. Nobody else could ever get into the race. It looked like he was going to get a challenge from that Brad Cox horse that I just mentioned, Dive Bomber, who came to him at the top of the lane, but General Partner kicked on again, and these two just much better than the rest.
Yeah, and he ran a 111 speed figure, a very impressive effort. That jump forward, even with the increased speed figure from that Valentine Candy race of a 101, that's a 10-point move forward. And I know you wanted to talk a little about that race, and I should mention it is one we upgraded quite substantially, something that I don't ever remember having to change a figure as much as this one, but I'm happy with it. Even after the upgrade, most of the horses who have run back have still improved over the revised number and not just by a couple points. So, good, strong race, and General Partners just another one. And that 111 makes him one of the top 2 year olds around based on speed figures.
Yeah, we'll see how far he wants to go. He's a son of Spitestown. It probably is a little more sprinter miler pedigree on the dam side, but he's definitely a horse that has quite a bit of talent. I mean, that 117 final time number, I have to think is one of the fastest that we've seen from any 2 year old. I guess that race out in California, the Best Pal, might have been a smidge faster. I forgot exactly what number we gave that, but General Partner, definitely a horse that's going to have stakes in his future. And I would imagine Dive Bomber, who was second, is going to be a heavy favorite wherever he shows up against Maiden Company next time out. Let's move on to Del Mar, and we'll discuss some of the stakes action that took place there this past weekend, topped, of course, by the Saturday feature, the Grade 1 Pacific Classic, sort of the West Coast counterpart to the Jockey Club Gold Cup that they ran on Saturday. And the Pacific Classic, Craig, almost definitely was the stronger of the two races, and I think we got a pretty interesting read on how some of these 3-year-olds might stack up against their older rivals in here. Nobody's going to say that the older horse division out in California is producing the best runners that we're going to see in the Breeders' Cup, but I still think it's meaningful that the two 3-year-olds in this race, Arabia Night and Go Rocket Ride, were able to finish first and second, I should say, completing the exacta against those older horses.
Yeah, agreed. And I don't think it's a big surprise. And I think the same exact thing would have happened in New York had 3 year olds running the Jockey Club Gold Cup. At least, some of the top ones like we got here. The older horse division just is not very good. I know this was a race we did on the forecast, and we both really liked the two 3 year olds and nobody else for the most part. So good strong race from them. They got good speed figures. Arabian Night a 126, which I think matched Arcangelo if memory serves, and the Travers Go Rocket Ride a 125. So even in defeat, he took another small step forward from his win in the Haskell. Um, yeah, good. Just a good race and what was expected. Not sure where these two will show up next. It's hard to say anymore. Maybe they'll go straight to the Breeders' Cup. Would seem odd to cut back for the Awesome again, but just something you'll have to follow in DRF and see what the reporting says where these horses are going to show up. But I think it's almost a foregone conclusion that the Breeders' Cup this year is going to be dominated by 3-year-olds. The Breeders' Cup Classic.
Yeah, it definitely feels like they are a pretty strong group coming into that race, and Arabian Night, I guess, adds his name to the list after being sort of one that had a lot of expectations and hype around him early in the season, but now he's achieving those results, and I think showed the way that he galloped out in that Haskell, where he sort of lost some focus maybe at the top of the stretch and then re-engaged at the end, showed that the mile and a quarter was really right within his wheelhouse because he was finishing well at the end of this race. Again, coming around the far turn into the quarter pole when Slow Down Andy raged up on the outside of him, it looked like Arabian Night was going to get really tested and maybe have to dig in the way that he wasn't able to last time in the Haskell. But once Flavien Prat asked him for his best and they got into that straightaway, he was able to find another gear. Though I would say that's a little bit of an optical illusion because you would expect Slow Down Andy to maybe have some trouble in the final quarter of a mile and a quarter race. He's probably one that just doesn't quite want to go that far. So I don't know if it was so much Arabian Night kicking on again as it was Slow Down Andy stopping. But Go Rocket Ride took a shot, and Arabian Night still able to hold him off. So these are two of the top 3-year-olds in the land, and we'll see how they stack up against some of those horses that contested the Travers last week. Craig, I don't have too much to say about the older horses in this race or anybody else. I guess Skinner, a mild disappointment, not to make up much ground through the final quarter, though. I already gave my thesis on him. We were handicapping this race. I don't think he wants to go this far, and I think we saw some evidence of that in here. I don't know what happened to Stiletto Boy. He got pulled up in the final quarter mile. I didn't see any reporting on that, but clearly just never traveled well, and this was not his day. But it'd be surprising if anybody else from this race, aside from the top two, was a player in the Classic.
Yeah, I was going to say you made a good point about Skinner. It certainly showed on the track. You could hear Trevor Denman kind of making a big call for him as they were coming into the stretch, and then he just flattened out as we've seen from him before. So mile and a quarter just doesn't seem to be his thing. Stiletto Boy did walk off the track, so hopefully he's okay. I know he's a favorite of both of us, really. I mean, he's just been a game horse that shows up, runs a lot of races, so hopefully they get him sorted out. Don't like to see any horses eased in a big race like that. But yeah, I agree with you on the older horses.
Let's move on to some of those other graded stakes on the Pacific Classic undercard Saturday. The Grade 2 Del Mar Mile went as race 7, which kicked off that late pick 5 sequence. And seems like De Jour has really figured things out at Del Mar this summer, Craig. He was a horse that had been kind of frustrating, had some stops and starts in his career, had shown real talent at different points, but was having trouble delivering in some of these top races. But now he's collected 2 stakes victories in a row, and he has gotten great trips both times, including this ride from Flavien Prat.
He did, and it was a little predictable, drawing the inside, getting the best rider, but it was a good race. He ran a career best TimeformUS speed figure, a 123 for renowned turf trainer Bob Baffert. Just kidding there. It seems like it's the only turf horse he's ever really had, but he's obviously a pretty good one, and he's turning the corner. I think, is he 5 now, I believe?
I want to say he is, yep.
Yeah, I think he's a 5-year-old, and he's right at the time he should be getting good. Hard to say really what the Breeders' Cup Mile is going to look like at this point. I'm sure we'll have some Euro shippers come in, but the way he's running now, I mean, I wouldn't totally say he doesn't have a chance. He's running good figures, and he's got a pretty versatile running style where he stays fairly close to the pace, but doesn't need to be up front.
The Breeders' Cup is being held in Southern California this year at Santa Anita, so I guess you want to pay a little bit of extra attention to some of these Southern California prep races, maybe more so than we typically would. De Jour is still going to have to do better because it feels like a lot of the talent in this division is concentrated more on the East Coast, although the mile division does look fairly wide open this year, and like you said, that's always a race at the Breeders' Cup where it feels like there's some European that comes over that proves really tough. So we'll see if De Jour is able to continue this form into the fall. Exalted, who was second here, maybe a little bit unlucky. Juan Hernandez, I guess, was trying to just be fortunate coming into the stretch because he committed to staying inside behind the two speeds that were coming back to the field, and just kind of got jammed up in there. I don't know what his plan was to get free, but it happened way too late. I don't think he was ever beating De Jour, but it should have been a little closer between these two.
Yeah, and it was his first race since May, so a bit of a layoff for him. Maybe they were giving him a freshener. I would expect him to move forward again. It's the first time he's been beaten on turf, but he keeps running better and better speed figures. So, again, he's another one. I wouldn't be shocked if he shows up in the Breeders' Cup Mile. And a lot of what is what you said, that it's in Southern California this year. So horses will be used to those courses and have shown they can run well over them. So, yeah, I'm not going to totally write them off. And yeah, like you said, the mile division also hasn't been the strongest this year in the States. I'm sure some strong Euros will come over, and we'll just have to see. We have some time. But the point being, normally I just kind of write off these California horses. But in this division, I'm not going to do that just yet.
Yeah, not that De Jour was some big upset, but I think we had some more normal results in the other graded stakes on the turf at Del Mar this past weekend, as far as the trainers are concerned. And by normal, I mean Phil D'Amato won. He just swept the rest of the stakes we're going to talk about on the grass, including the Del Mar Handicap, won by Gold Phoenix. And this horse is putting together a pretty nice resume so far this year, Craig. This was his third graded stakes victory of the season. And interestingly, all at different distances. He's won at a mile and an eighth when he took, the Eddie Reed, and now a mile and 3/8. So this is a horse that's in great form right now. But again, typically we see this division get a whole lot tougher moving into the fall. So I'd be somewhat surprised if he could be effective in a race like the Breeders' Cup, but he's definitely one of the best that Southern California has to offer right now.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add on this one. He was a decisive winner. He actually wound up costing me the pick five. But that's how it goes. I mean, it wasn't a big pick five. Had the runner up who I liked won, then I would have hit it and it would have paid a whole lot more money. But he was clearly the best horse, so no complaints. Don't think this group is that strong. It's nobody I would expect to be competitive in the Breeders' Cup. I'm sure they'll probably try with Gold Phoenix since he ran in it last year, but I just don't see it.
Yeah, Gold Phoenix did get a great trip in this race, but always traveled like a winner. The pace was unexpectedly fast. I don't think you could have projected that a horse like Azul Coast was going to go quite as quickly as he did, pushing Crosby Beach on the front end, and those two just ran off in the early stages, and it kind of set the race up to collapse a little bit. And I actually think the runner-up, 911 Turbo, ran really well to be second because he was one of the ones to make the first move into that race after stalking in third. Not the easiest position to race in when the pace is going to collapse like that. So he ran well, but Gold Phoenix gets another victory. Let's move on to the Grade 3 Green Flash, this one going just 5 furlongs on the turf, and another Phil D'Amato trained winner in Motorious. This one, another logical result, as this horse was just the class of the field coming in from a performance at Churchill Downs in the springtime where he had shown up against some really tough runners, finishing second in that turf sprint, and coming back here, he just made a lot of sense and got the right kind of pace set up to deliver this victory.
Yeah, now he's clearly a horse you would expect to be a contender in the Breeders' Cup. Turf Sprint, obviously, it's at 5 furlongs this year, which is right up his alley. He got a 122 TimeformUS speed figure, and just a pretty powerful performance. He won by almost 2 lengths. Did so very easily. I mean, he got an okay trip in that he didn't get in trouble, but he lost a lot of ground, and just to me, he was much, much the best.
Yeah, when you win a turf sprint going 5 furlongs by nearly 2 lengths, you're asserting your dominance. And I mean, he did it, coming wide into the stretch and just drew off from this field, always looking like a winner. Nice call by you on Cherubic Factor, who got up for second at a big price. He got the pace setup that you were expecting, just wasn't nearly in the same league as Motorius, but did complete the exacta in this race. And, the pace figures for this race are not going to be color coded in red. It's kind of hard to achieve in a 5 furlong turf sprint, but it was always going to be a race where it was really tough to wire on the front end because they were moving up front. And Motorius is a closer, but the kind of closer that doesn't have to come from so far back. He's got enough tactical speed to stay within range of those leaders so that he's in position to take over when he launches that run at the top of the stretch. Move on to the Grade 3 Torrey Pines, the one extra dirt race that we're going to talk about at Del Mar from this past weekend. This one going the mile for the 3-year-old fillies. And there was a big scratch in this race of the Bob Baffert trained Fiza, who I would imagine would have been the favorite, and probably a substantial favorite, but she didn't play. And that made the job of Ceiling Crusher, the eventual winner, easier from a couple of perspectives because it took some of the speed out, and also she came in one post position, so she didn't have to go quite as wide. And the intentions here were really clear, Craig. They rated her in the prior start. It didn't work out. I think the rider switch to Edwin Maldonado kind of suggested what the intention was going to be, and they sent her hard from the outside post position, got to the front, never looked back.
Yeah, I think it was kind of ironic. Faiza was scratched because Bob Baffert said you can't win from the outside, and Ceiling Crusher wound up winning from the post that Faiza would have been in. Powerhouse performance. Things were made a little bit easier when Flying Connection rated for some reason. Not sure what was going on there, but I don't think she was getting the lead anyway with the intense Ceiling Crusher had. She ran on to be second, but nobody was catching Ceiling Crusher. Won by half a dozen lengths. Got back to those good speed figures she's been running, a 112. So good, strong filly. I don't know what the future's going to hold for her. Doesn't seem like a Breeders' Cup type to me. The 3-year-olds are definitely way behind in this division, the olders, but she is a Calbred, so she's going to have lots of options or where she can run next.
Yeah, normally wouldn't spend much time on this race on the rundown, but like you said, we just haven't seen too many of those 110 plus speed figures from the 3-year-old fillies this year, so I guess you have to keep a horse like Ceiling Crusher in mind heading into the fall. Then we'll close out the Del Mar action by discussing the Del Mar Derby, a Grade 2 event run on Sunday. This just not the strongest edition of the Del Mar Derby, Craig. I don't know exactly what the final speed figure is going to be for this race, but the winner conclude. I would say a horse that probably doesn't want to go 9 furlongs. That's not his ideal distance, but he was just superior to this field and was barely able to hold on at the end.
Yeah, he wound up. It's probably going to be about a 115, but I'm guessing I'll probably have that speed figure tonight or early tomorrow morning and put it out there. And normally, I mean, a 115 for 3-year-olds this time of year, it's pretty good, but this isn't a normal year for 3-year-old turf runners. We've seen a lot better, so I tend to agree with you. This one feels more like a miler, and that last furlong, watching it sure seemed to confirm that.
Let's move on to Kentucky Downs, where they began their meet this past week. Series of high-pursed races, some graded stakes. We'll discuss a few of them, topped by the Grade 3 Mint Millions, which was run on Saturday. This one was won by the European shipper Ancient Rome, and pretty smart to come over for this race, Craig, because even though this horse was running in Europe, he's a Kentucky bred, so he was eligible for the full purse and got that here by winning this race over that European-style course that they have at Kentucky Downs. Not sure what it really means in terms of his prospects moving forward or some of the others in this race. We were talking about it offline a little bit before we started recording. These speed figures at Kentucky Downs are just really hard to know what predictive value they might have moving forward, whether they're really accurate just based on, trusting the times and the fractions of these races. I know you were trying to do some pace figures this year for Kentucky Downs, whereas you were unable to make those in the past. So tough races to really assess, but Ancient Rome, a horse who had some decent European form, was able to beat his American rivals here.
Yeah, I'll address the figures real quick. They've put in the GPS system there, and we do time all the races for TimeformUS to make sure that the times are good. How much it applies to other races when these horses ship out, I have no idea. I've talked about it many times in the past. Generally, what happens at Kentucky Downs stays at Kentucky Downs. Horses either like the course or they don't, and I've had my best successes betting against or betting on horses who have run poorly at Kentucky Downs. It doesn't mean the horses who win these races aren't good. It's just so different from everywhere else. Ancient Rome actually wound up with a 125 time form US speed figure. He was one of the rare horses that came in with a huge time form rating for just coming out of a handicap race. He showed a 124, which is something usually reserved for graded stakes over there. So I guess there was something in the that they saw in that race to have it rated so high, and he delivered here. But again, just I mean, these are good races. They give away a lot of money. I just don't know how much the speed figures are going to transfer.
Yeah, that was a really good race that he had won in his prior start at, I believe it was Goodwood, a large field handicap. There was another horse that came out of there to run at Saratoga towards the end of the meet. But yeah, I don't know what to make of it either. This was a race where the pace really held together. I think that's important to note. And Ancient Rome was just kind of perched outside of the leaders the whole way. Stitched and Smoke and Tea, who were first and second for most of the race and just hung in there, basically only getting passed by Ancient Rome in the stretch. The disappointment was Annapolis, who went off as the even money favorite. Was kind of surprised there was no inquiry in this race. Who knows? Maybe they don't even have a head on at Kentucky Downs. I don't know what's going on there. But he seemed to get cut off in deep stretch. I don't think he was ever winning, but he obviously lost some momentum right at the end of the race. But like you said, one of these horses that has really strong form elsewhere. Maybe it just didn't translate to Kentucky Downs. I'm not sure that he necessarily loses any stature in this race, but he has been a horse that I think just in general, a little disappointing this year, losing both of those races at Saratoga to Casa Creed and now losing here. I kind of wonder if maybe Annapolis is one that just hasn't got on from his 3-year-old season. Let's move on to another stakes from Kentucky Downs. They ran a pair of derbies going the mile, or a pair of stakes, I should say, going the mile and 5/16 distance on the turf course there. One, the Dueling Grounds Derby, the other, the Dueling Grounds Oaks. We'll talk about both of them. The Derby was a Grade 3 event on Sunday, won by Anglophile, and this horse got a great trip, slipping up the inside. He was able to get this victory for trainer Brian Lynch over the heavy favorite Far Bridge, another Todd Pletcher runner that went down to defeat at a short price here. Far Bridge, though, Craig, I think he got himself beat because he was lugging in at the top of the stretch. Seemed like the horse couldn't quite perceive when the straightaway was starting at Kentucky Downs because they came into the lane and he kept turning to the left, and I think caused himself to duck in behind some other horses and lost momentum there that might have cost him the race.
Yeah, it very well could have. He's not the only one who can't tell where the stretch starts at Kentucky Downs. Watching those, now I've seen hundreds of them by now, and it still get thrown. But yeah, I mean, this was, I think, a pretty strong race. Both of the top two wound up with 120 speed figures. Huge pace difference between this and the next race we're going to talk about. This race was actually a couple seconds slower than the other one, but I think you can totally throw the times out the window. Both of these horses got big upgrades for closing into that crazy slow pace, and it was a decent gap back to third figure-wise, all the way to a 112. These figures fit for these horses, so I'm fine with them. But again, just a crazy pace scenario here.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of wanted to ask you about it because, I mean, I'm guessing you timed these races, but it's almost hard to believe that they went so much slower in this race than they did the Oaks, and the final times have such difference, especially watching this race because it's not like the field was all bunched together. I mean, they just let Wizard of Westwood go out on the front end by himself, just dawdling through those slow fractions on a 3-length lead most of the way, and he still came back to the field, so the race kind of came apart anyway. It was just very weird visually, but I guess that's Kentucky Downs, just weird visually in general.
Yeah, I did. All I did was time the final time. I can tell you they're accurate, but when I see how crazy different the fractions are, I am going to go back and check those today just to be sure. But the final time checked out, and that would lead me to believe that the pace figures are probably okay because it was the only real explanation that these horses could be so much slower than the fillies.
Then the race right after, or right before that, I should say, was the Dueling Grounds Oaks for the fillies. And this was a result that made me happy, Craig, because I think I've mentioned on this podcast or our stakes previews before that I was a follower of Freitas the Red, a fan of this horse for trainer Ken McPeak. And I was disappointed with the ride that she got in the Belmont Oaks, a race that I thought that she could have won if they had maybe taken trying to save ground a little more seriously in that race. And then I thought she had run deceptively well in her prior start at Ellis. And I said on our podcast last time that I was waiting for her to run at Kentucky Downs basically in this race going longer, and she got that opportunity here and was able to deliver. Though obviously the pace really helped her.
Yeah, this one was an insane pace. The early pace was like a 170 plus TimeformUS pace figure. A horse Callie's Grift or Callie's Grid, who was a big long shot in here, kind of ran off from the field, but some others were trying to stay in fairly close attendance and just led to all red fractions in the race. Much faster final time, but because of that pace, Freitas the Red only gets a 114 TimeformUS speed figure. The final time was obviously better. She got a 120, but this is one of those we gave a pace downgrade as opposed to the other a pace upgrade. And I know you'll see a lot on social media, people judge final times, and just want to stress you simply can't do that on turf, or you're going to have just a whole bunch of terrible speed figures that have no predictive value.
I am going to throw you a curveball, Craig, and throw one more race onto the rundown right now, and that's the race that they ran right after the Oaks and the Derby, that handicap that maybe we're trying to pretend didn't happen. That was the first race of the National Thoroughbred League, which we haven't talked about at all personally, but something that I know has gotten a lot of chatter on social media. But I do want to talk about this race, Craig, because the winning performance by Saratoga Flash, I have no idea where this came from, but I mean, I imagine this is one of the highest speed figures of the week, the 127.
Yeah, and the reason I didn't put it on, I just saw it and I was like, it's almost too high to believe. But again, I would have to pull up the worksheet. I think there were a bunch of mile races on the card and we timed them all and it checked out. And he just ran a whole bunch faster race, not only than the horses in this field, but the horses on the entire card. Yeah, I'm looking at it now. There were like 4 or 5 8 furlong races, and the run up was reasonably close for all of them. And this horse just ran a really fast race, and it's one the speed figure. If they were all going to run back at Kentucky Downs, I'd probably love this horse, but they're not. So I'll more than likely expect him to regress back to what we've seen from him before.
Yeah, I don't know what's happened to this horse recently, but I remember him from when he was running in New York, and he was a horse that was struggling to win a New York bred N2X. It was kind of claiming level, and obviously he's improved a lot since then, but I never expected a performance like this out of him that we saw on Sunday. So quite an effort by Saratoga Flash to end that Sunday card at Kentucky Downs. One more race to mention from Kentucky Downs. I think this was going back to Saturday's card, the Gunrunner Stakes for the 3-year-olds. And Talk of the Nation, another one of these races going a mile, Craig, that produced a very fast time and I guess a fast speed figure in turn, though I think you had to downgrade this one a little bit because it just came up too fast to really believe. Talk of the Nation ran well to win this race, but again, this is another number that I have trouble taking at face value.
Yeah, it's just really hard. Like I said, that we're telling you what they ran at Kentucky Downs doesn't really mean that's what they're going to run somewhere else. I think this race was on Thursday as I'm going through trying to find it.
It was Saturday's 8th race.
Saturday's 8th race. Okay. But he wound up with a 122 TimeformUS speed figure, which, I mean, it's a little high for him, but it's not anything we've seen him be a good horse all along. It's just one of those, I just take it with a grain of salt. Good effort from him. Not sure the horse is in behind. Yeah, I mean, when you look at the chart, the speed figures for the top two line up, the rest maybe not so much, and it was a pretty tightly grouped field. We did give it a pace downgrade, obviously, and it's just one of those head scratchers where I try to use the time since I know they were accurate once I did the video timing. And I say accurate in that we adjust them so they all line up with each other at least, and it's one I'll be watching going forward to see if it deserves a downgrade.
Yeah, just some of the also rans. I mean, that's the nature of turf racing. You want to give accurate numbers to the winners, but sometimes in horses that finish behind them can get pulled along to these higher speed figures than they really deserve. So it's hard to find where the number really fits for the whole field. That's just turf, whereas typically on dirt you have bigger margins between the runners. That's more indicative of their relative abilities. So yeah, we'll see how these horses do in the future. But like we've been saying, proceed with caution with some of these Kentucky Downs numbers. Then we'll finish up this podcast with one more race as we visit Ellis Park, going all the way back, I think, 8 days before this to the Monday of last week, a maiden special weight that was won going a mile by Generous Tipper, and a horse who was making the third start of his career and also the third route attempt. So he definitely had some miles under his belt already, and I think it paid off here.
Yeah, it did. This one kind of surprised me when I did the query that I run for the rundown, but we know Ken McPeak likes to run his horses. It was the third time for this horse routing. As you said, he had debuted on turf, and it seemed like everything clicked here. He got a 103 TimeformUS speed figure. He did it just pulling away from the field through the stretch, winning by over 7 lengths. And if the race had went another half furlong, it might have been 15 the way he was just drawing away. So good effort by him. One that looks like ground won't be a problem and has some good races in his future.
Yeah, I mean, he did get the kind of trip that you want to get at Ellis Park, on the rail the whole way. Not that I looked up this day or, am saying that there was a huge rail bias, but just generally at Ellis, he got the kind of trip that you want to get, never having to deal with kickback. But he ran a big race. He had run well in his prior start. It's got an interesting pedigree. The Dam was actually a really good horse that was sort of a star at Emerald Downs. I think she won 9 of 10 races. So he's bred to be a good horse, and he's shown some talent in these 2 dirt races so far. So he's another one that I imagine we'll see in a route stakes race, probably in Kentucky sometime this fall. Well, that wraps up our recap of this week, Craig, and some housekeeping. This is going to be our only podcast this week. I know that we're both going to take some advantage of this week break between, for me, between Saratoga and the Belmont at the Big A meet. So I'll be doing a little bit of traveling at the end of this week. So we're going to skip the forecast this week, but we'll be looking to get back to our usual schedule with our Pacecast next week. So no podcast for this next week, but you can look forward. I think, Craig, you might do a stakes preview or two, probably at Kentucky Downs. So other content to check out on the DRF YouTube channel in the meantime.
Yeah, and that's a reason I'm not just getting someone else to fill in for you, because I'll actually be at Kentucky Downs on Saturday. I'm traveling Friday, so if you see me there, come up and say hello. I'm a much nicer guy in person than I am on Twitter, I think, for the most part, or X, whatever it's called these days. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I've been to the parking lot once just to see what the track looked like from the rest stop right behind it, but never actually been there for racing, so should be in quite an experience, and looking forward to it. And we'll be back with the Pacecast next week.
Yeah, I've never been there either, so I'll have to report back on what your experience was like. It should be a fun time, Craig. Well, everybody, thanks for listening to the podcast this week. Remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcast. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, thanks for tuning in, and make sure to catch not the forecast, but the TimeformUS Pacecast coming up a week from now, next Tuesday.